Chapter 4. Karnic's Command. Karnic stood, taking in the moist air rolling off the Missouri River that flowed a few hundred yards to the rear of the armory. As he took in a few deep breaths, the crisp air caused him to think of his good friend and commander, Captain Sawyer. He thought not of his death, but of the still unknown shooter and of Sawyer's resting spot, with 16 of his men overlooking the river. Standing on the front steps where Sawyer was murdered, he turned in the direction in which they were buried and rendered a respectful salute to those lost over the last few weeks, since taking the armory and losing their commander. Shortly after all, electronics failed. If there had ever been a day full of unexpected outcomes, it was the fateful day they went on the offensive. Karnic felt they had achieved the impossible. With little planning and supplies, up until they reached the podium, everything had mostly gone as planned. Much of the rest of that day remained a blur to Karnic once Sawyer fell. A blur to Karnic, but not to those who witnessed the wrath he released on the UN soldiers in the direction from which the shot came. Everyone watched as Robert leaped from the roof above, charging off in the direction of the shot he fired a second after the assassins. After Sawyer had taken his last breath, everyone watched as Karnic ran to stop him, or so they thought. He quickly passed Robert, not slowing down until he began receiving fire from the top of the hill. Even under fire, he slowed only as he moved from the pavement to the grass off the side of the road. Watching in disbelief as Karnic and then Robert ran by, the men guarding the front gate looked at one another. Although they didn't know what his plan was, once Karnic started taking fire from those hiding behind what was left of their cars, they responded with all the return fire they had. Then they watched as Karnic closed in, moving through the first 2 men he came to with ease, relieving them of their weapons only to give them back the bullets each time his finger pulled the trigger. No longer firing at the UN troops for fear of hitting Karnic, they listened and watched as the minutes passed. Many of the men with their rifles in hand attempted to assist Karnic, only to be told to return to their posts by Sergeant Lee. "Back to your post. You don't want to get mixed up in what is going on up there." From the screams they heard coming from the area, many agreed. When silence finally fell, many wondered if it meant the end of Karnic. Every man wanted to go to his aid or finish what he had started. Sergeant Lee felt the need to do something as eyes darted from the hilltop and back again. "Second squad!" Lee shouted. Within seconds they were standing in front of him, ready for what they knew would be his next order. Speaking directly to the squad leader, Lee gave the order. "Use both sides of the road, move up the hill, and find Karnic if possible." "Roger." "Roger," he replied, turning with his squad to charge the hill in hopes of coming back with Karnic. They came to a halt only a few feet from where they had started, each of them watching who they assumed was Karnic step from the barricade of cars and begin walking their way. The closer he came, the more unbelievable the sight of him became. They watched as blood dripped from the knife in his left hand, and smoke came from the pistol in his right. That sight mixed with his blood-soaked uniform caused many to feel a little pity for those in the direction from which he had just come. "Radio for a medic," Sergeant Lee ordered his radio telephone operator. It was a message that became impossible to send after a bright flash in the distance, followed by a light roar. As soon as the RTO keyed the mic, the radio lost all power. The RTO and Sergeant Lee looked at each other in puzzlement, even though they knew what had just occurred: an electromagnetic pulse. They turned their attention back to Karnic, who was now standing only feet away and looking up at the sky. "EMP," he said softly, as if he didn't look like a character out of a slasher film. From that point on, it was like a switch was flipped in him, pulling him out of the aftermath of the day's events and back to the controlled leader they knew. Most had forgotten about Robert as they watched Karnic charge up the hill. Robert had developed tunnel vision from the second he leaped from the roof and began running. His sole focus was a brush pile 100 yards to the left of where the UN troops had been located. Filled with a feeling of failure, he had to confirm the shooter was dead. Knowing his bullet had made contact, Robert expected to see the shooter's body lying on the ground as he approached, but to his great disappointment, there wasn't anything. Upon closer inspection, he began widening his search after spotting blood on the ground where the shooter had been. He searched frantically, ignoring the gunfire and screams 100 yards to his right. Off in the distance, a flicker of light caught his eye. Quickly, he hurried through the brush and located the source. Reaching down, he knew it was the rifle that had killed Sawyer as he pulled it from the thick, dead grass. Robert looked all around the area after picking up the rifle, and after a few minutes, he was fairly certain that its owner was long gone. He ran his finger along the side of the rifle where his bullet had cut a deep groove that ended in blood spatter. Disgusted with the thought of the shooter getting away, Robert turned to make his way back to camp, filled with sorrow. The person he felt sorrow for the most was Kate. He could still hear her screams, even though he knew it wasn't possible. It was her screams that told him who the shooter's bullet had struck, and she was the one person he didn't want to face. Not one to dwell on the past, Karnic looked out over the armory grounds. It was a marvelous sight to him, for he had never imagined that things would turn out as they had. Everywhere he looked, he saw men and women training, thousands of them, and more showed every day. Half of his men spent their days sorting out those with military backgrounds and those who came to join the UCM without prior experience. The other half of his men spent the day training the inexperienced. Communications had been difficult since the EMP, but he felt fortunate to have the supplies that survived. The one thing he wished he had was a working Humvee, those that he had sat gathering dust since the EMP. Everything had been tested, and what didn't work was discarded, which turned out to be most everything that contained computer chips. All vehicles made after the 1970s were almost guaranteed to be fried, with the exception of the few stored in enclosed metal buildings, which acted much like Faraday cages. As the EMP struck the metal buildings surrounding the electrical components, the pulse was dispersed into the ground. Colonel Marks and his men worked day and night to resurrect vehicles that had been deemed outdated. On many occasions, they had recovered those used as monuments in museums and at VFW halls. On one such excursion, they even found a machine that brought the troops' morale up greatly, a machine to create patches representing the UCM. He took it on himself to design one in the shape of a black diamond bordered in infantry blue, and in the center, it held 2 lightning bolts crossed at the tips. In it were the words, Bellum contra Tyrannidum, Latin for War against Tyranny. For the final touch, the bot Tom held a ribbon with 17 at one end and 76 at the other, representing the country's birth, 1776. Karnic hated using a generator and the little fuel they had to produce the new unit patches, but he thought it necessary not only for morale, but also for identification in operations to come. Although he wouldn't say it, out of all the unit patches he had worn during his time in the military, he was thrilled to have it on his sleeve. Not only to have it on his sleeve, but also to hand them out personally to those who joined the fight. But since the EMP, he really didn't know who the fight was against. The EMP changed a great deal, and in the weeks since he wondered if the country had been attacked by another, or if it were those in their own government. Either way, he would soon know something when his 2 scouting parties returned. Sierra had set out west on horseback, and Angelique had headed east on a vintage dirt bike. Both had taken 2 weeks of supplies and other personnel for security. Karnic knew it would be a few more days before they would return and was going over all possibilities for action after receiving the information they had learned. For now, he could see a more pressing issue. Food. From where he stood, he couldn't even imagine the amount of food required for all the people now under his command. With rations already cut to 1 MRE a day, something had to be done. Looking over to the lower buildings, he hoped that Colonel Marks was back, but saw nothing where his deuce and a half was normally parked. "Private," he called out, knowing that he was standing only a few feet back, just within the door. "Yes, Sergeant," the young soldier said, eager to do what Karnic asked. "Run down and see if the colonel is back. If not, then wait there until he returns and let him know that I would like to have a word with him." "Yes, Sergeant." He ran off. Since the EMP, Karnic kept a few soldiers around to relay messages and conserve the batteries of the few working radios they possessed. Now it was time for the part of the day he enjoyed most, viewing the new recruits. It seemed every morning now that he handed out patches to newly arrived members. It was something that had never crossed his mind he would ever be doing. Each time he did, he thought about how much Sawyer would have loved it. Even though this wasn't something a sergeant would normally do, these were not normal times. Marks had outranked him when they were all soldiers in the U.S. Army. But this wasn't the Army. This was the United Constitutional Militia. Here, no one dared challenge Karnic's position, especially not after what he and his team had accomplished. He could see that Smith had the new men and women formed up, and he signaled that he was on his way. Walking up to the formation, he could tell that most were former soldiers, veterans who had already served their time, but they were standing here ready to do it once more. This time it was for their freedoms and no pay. Sergeant Smith met him just yards from the first rank. In his hands he carried a box filled with new unit patches for Karnic to pass out. "Everything ready?" Karnic knew that Smith was the one person he could count on to have everything in order. "Yes, Sergeant. Ready when you are." "Very well then. Let's proceed." "Company, attention!" Smith called out, and those in formation snapped to attention. Karnic began walking slowly along, about a yard from the men and women at the front of the formation. As he looked at the many different uniforms they wore, he thought, "This is truly a militia." Although there were many different styles of uniforms, they all had one thing in common. All of them had been dyed black. This made it easier to tell the UCM personnel from others who may be out there. The dyeing process didn't change the uniforms completely black. It simply changed the camouflage patterns to several shades of gray and black, in many cases making them more effective than they once were. Karnic walked up and down the ranks of new UCM soldiers, making eye contact with each new volunteer. On the first pass, one soldier caught his eye. Although it was a sight he never expected to see, he didn't show his overwhelming surprise. Karnic moved on from the man as if he were any other joining up for a fight. As he came to the end of the new recruits, he turned to Smith. Karnic's chest puffed out from holding a deep breath. He had his bottom lip sucked into his mouth as if he were trying to bite it off, and his head was held a little higher than normal. With his voice low enough so that only Smith could hear, he lowered his head, freed his bottom lip, and asked as he exhaled, "Did I just walk by a guy wearing a World War II veteran's hat?" It was amazing to Karnic. The man looked ready to fight. Smith couldn't control himself when the question came his way. A big smile appeared on his face. "Yes," he answered. The two men turned and quickly walked back to the old soldier. As they approached, they both had the same question on their minds. How old is this guy? When they came to where the man was standing, Karnic couldn't help but snap to attention and salute, as did Smith. Their salute was returned. "What's your name, soldier?" Karnic asked with a slight hint of excitement in his voice. "Bellamy, sir," the old warrior said with fight in his voice. As Karnic was about to speak again, Bellamy spoke up first and loud. "Listen, Sergeant, with all due respect, I know I'm old, but I'm not going anywhere but to the fight. That will be with you or without you. I survived on the beaches of Normandy, pushed through the Battle of the Bulge, and fought the last few months in the Pacific. And I will be damned if I'm going to watch from a deathbed somewhere as my country is torn apart by its own government." Taken aback by the old soldier's short speech, Karnic shook his head slightly, understanding the old soldier meant every word. Karnic had looked down by the man's side while he was giving his speech and noticed the weapon he was packing, an M1 Garand. When Bellamy had finished, Karnic asked, "Would you like a lighter, more modern weapon?" Bellamy looked down at his rifle and then back up to Karnic. "Hell no. This girl is why I'm here today." Surprised by how much fight was in the old soldier, Karnic stood quietly. Even though he wasn't going to dismiss the man, the thought had crossed his mind. Instead, he replied, "See the supply sergeant for ammunition." Then he saluted and reached out with a unit patch in his hand. "Welcome to the United Constitutional Militia." When he was on the last row of soldiers, meeting each one and handing out the unit patch, he spotted the private he had sent to find Colonel Marks running toward him.